Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday school lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Well, welcome to June and to a new quarter in our Sunday school studies. We are going to go to a little, very infrequently read book in the Old Testament, and we hope to make sense out of it for you and to put it into the context of this new quarter's concerns. So welcome to In the Word this morning, and we turn to Dr. Magnus. He is interested in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. That's so right. We've got to deal with this prophet Zephaniah.
Yeah, well, let's place him in history first. Zephaniah lived during the latter part of the 600s BC. We think he may have begun his ministry around 640 BC.
Or 630, somewhere in that
around
range.
there. And it's during the reign of one of the greatest prophets of Judah,
oh yes,
the southern kingdom, the King Josiah. I think it's important to remember that by the time we get down to the 600s BC, the northern kingdom of Israel is no more.
Correct.
It's been conquered and absorbed into the Assyrian Empire.
And then the Babylonian Empire is coming.
Right. So what we're talking about here is just prophets speaking to the little country of Judah, the southern kingdom,
yes,
in between the devastation caused by Assyria and the coming destruction about to be caused by Babylon.
And don't forget Egypt. Egypt is always very close at hand to the south.
That's true.
And Egyptians usually frequently made trouble for Judah.
Yeah.
And so it was like being caught between a rock and a hard place
and another hard place.
Yeah, and another
three rocks and hard places.
Well, and furthermore, there are those who think that during the time of Zephaniah, that even the Scythians made a foray into the coastal region along the eastern Mediterranean.
The Scythians are people we think of as kind of barbaric people.
People.
Up at the steppes of Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah, who've come all the way down into the eastern Mediterranean.
And they were a factor in the fall of Assyria, actually. And even then, eventually, in times when the Babylonian Empire, which didn't last very long, succumbed. Yeah. Anyway, they were horse warriors, and some have even said they introduced fighting from horseback.
So poor little Judah was really stuck between a lot of warlike, powerful empires here.
Well, at least, the Syrians were not the threat that they had been, because they had been integrated into the Assyrian
They'd also been conquered, yeah.
Yeah, so.
But there's one brief shining moment here where Josiah, a boy king under the influence of the high priest Hilkiah,
yes,
had led Judah to some significant religious reforms.
In about the year roughly 620 as a round date, that reform took place when they discovered the law in the temple, and they read the law publicly before the king and the courtiers, and saw that, well, we're not doing what the law calls on us to do. Right. So they reformed the religion and closed all active shrines, and so that Jerusalem
to other gods.
Not even to Yahweh.
Yeah, outside the shrines outside
of Jerusalem.
Oh, yes.
And so they closed all of those and put, you might say, all their marbles in the Jerusalem basket, and depended on Jerusalem to be their salvation.
And that reform movement under Josiah's authority was led in part by a female prophet named Huldah,
Yes.
who would have had a very powerful impact on the religious reformation that took place during this period of time.
Well, when they came up with the Reformation, they wanted endorsement from a person who was considered to be a true prophet. And they went to her, and she backed them and gave an oracle saying that this was the right thing to do, and so they carried it out. And it had a profound impact on the mindset of these people. Jerusalem became the city and the hope, and the temple became then the hope for their survival.
Unfortunately, that would only last another 30, 35 years
Not
or
long,
so.
not
Very
long.
long. Now, we might mention why the need for such a far-reaching religious reformation during this period of time.
Okay, what had happened since Hezekiah?
Yeah.
Now, you'll notice Hezekiah's name is in the genealogy of this prophet.
Yeah, in verse 1 of this prophetic book of Zephaniah, we learn that Zephaniah the prophet was actually a descendant of the great...
Of a man named Hezekiah.
Right.
He's not called the king, but the thought is that he had to have been the king. Otherwise, why bother with
going back 4 generations?
Going back that many generations,
and
yes.
Hezekiah had been the last great reformer king.
Yes.
About 100 years, 90 to 100 years earlier than this.
The reforms of Hezekiah were far-reaching because, for one thing, during his reign, the northern kingdom was shut down, and there were refugees pouring into Jerusalem, and the geographical area of Jerusalem was more than doubled under Hezekiah.
That was back during the time of Isaiah the prophet.
Exactly.
So now we're about 90 to 100 years later with another great reformer king, Josiah.
But now what happened when Hezekiah died? He was succeeded by a son who was just the opposite.
Just the opposite. Manasseh was his name, and unfortunately he ruled for 55 long, horrible years.
Well, viewed from the prophetic aspect, horrible, but maybe from international politics, he was shrewd duck, you might say, who got along with, it was a juggling act. First Assyria, then Babylon, and then Egypt. And he managed to keep them all pacified. So it was a time of relative peace, but at what cost?
Right, and the prophets focused on, and the book of 2 Kings focuses on the negative side of his ministry.
Importation
his
of
kingship.
Baalism and all other kinds of gods and goddesses.
So it's as if every time he made some kind of a military or political concession to another nation, he adopted the worship of their gods as a way of...
Well, that's the way everybody did it in those days.
Right.
So he was just being like everybody else.
So when we read the passage we're about to read, we're going to see that rampant polytheism, paganism, has entered the life of the people of Judah. And it's largely due, not completely, but largely due to the reign of Manasseh and his policies.
Yes, and his policies. Exactly.
His policies.
It was a policy of appeasement. And, those that go along, get along. And,
well, let's read the results of some of Manasseh's policies and what Zephaniah has to say about them.
By the way, his name means Yahweh, the
Yah part.
Yah on the end part, protects or hides or guards, something like that.
Okay.
Is what is, and it's a very interesting name for a prophet. But it puts the emphasis on Israel's God, traditional God.
Sure.
As over against Canaanite gods. Okay, we skip then the opening verses where the thesis of the book is stated, which is a thesis of coming judgment from God.
Destruction is on its way.
And that's connected with the title for today's lesson, The Day of the Lord.
Okay. We'll talk about that phrase in a minute.
Yes. We begin then with verse 4. I will stretch out my hand, and this is God, the prophet speaking for God. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. I will destroy every remnant of Baal worship in this place, the very names of the idolatrous priests, those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry host, those who bow down and swear by the Lord, and who also swear by Molech, those who turn back from following the Lord, and neither seek the Lord nor inquire of him. Now we leave out the following verses 7 through 13, which we'll talk about in a moment, and continue with 14. The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. The cry on the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty warrior shouts his battle cry. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness, a day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers. Now we skip the rest of chapter 1 and go to verse 3 of chapter 2. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. So there's another day of the Lord, but this time it's the day of the Lord's anger.
Right. Well, it starts out in verse 4 with a warning against Judah. I will stretch out my hand. Now, stretching out the hand can be a positive gesture or a negative gesture. You can stretch out your hand to bless, I believe.
Yes.
Would be one way. But that's clearly not what's being talked about here.
No.
This is...
here's a warrior image for God. And that image in the Old Testament is very frequent.
Yeah, we see it most directly down in verse 14 of our printed text, where the mighty warrior shouts his battle cry. And that's a metaphorical reference to God who's coming to
that's the way it's understood here.
To bring destruction.
Yes.
But back up in verse 4, this stretching out of the hand is a warning that God is about to punish Judah.
Judah and Jerusalem.
Right.
And you may wonder why they are addressed in this way. Because we now know that, as a matter of fact, there were like two political entities that are involved here. That Judah had a set of elders who met apparently separately from the leadership in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was more a royal city where the king not only ruled in the city but owned the city. That was the case ever since David. David captured it. It is in fact the city of David. But then that did not destroy the clan and tribal organization of the people of Judah who lived outside of the city. And so sometimes there are places in the prophets where it looks like the organization outside of the city was in opposition to the organization that ruled in the city, especially in Jeremiah. Jeremiah was protected by the forces of Judah
against the king
and his establishment.
Right.
And Jeremiah would have been long dead had it not been for the protection offered him by this secondary political unit. So when you're talking about Judah and Jerusalem, you're saying the whole thing in both cases is corrupt.
Yeah. So verse 4 goes on to discuss the rampant polytheism that has infected life in Judah, especially in Jerusalem, and especially at the temple, as a result of
Even at the temple.
even at the temple.
And Jeremiah makes this very clear, and so does Ezekiel.
Yeah, as a result of King Manasseh's policies. The first.
Well, then there is a retreat. After Josiah is murdered in 609, then there is a retreat to the policy, an attempt to retreat to the policies of Manasseh, especially by Jehoiakim.
So that kind of wiped out the reforms of Josiah that
Exactly.
we're reading about here in Zephaniah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the first god mentioned is Baal, and this is a god that we've seen in many places as early as the Israelites coming through the wilderness on their return to Canaan. And over in Moab, they encounter the worship of Baal.
Well, let me say a word
there.
about Baal because, I usually accent the first syllable, Baal.
Okay.
It's a word in their language which means Lord, Master.
This is Canaanite.
Canaanite.
Language.
Well, Canaanite is really the name of the Hebrew language back then. We know about now the religion of Baal, or Baal, as you want to say it, because of an accidental discovery of a huge accumulation of documents in a brand new language that we didn't know existed. And that began in the year 1928 or 9, when a farmer digging to do something agricultural banged into something, and it turned out to be bricks that were really documents. And the French had the mandate of this place. It was called Ras Shamra, and its ancient name was Ugarit, on the Mediterranean shore up in Lebanon, Syria, in that area. And lo and behold, the French excavated the place and landed on the library of a priest of Baal. And here were all the stories, the myths, the legends of Baal. Now, for the very first time, we have documents coming from the religion of Baal that we can read, get into their minds, and we don't have to depend upon what the Bible has to say about Baal. It's really a fabulous discovery.
Well, some of the things we've learned, and we see it in the Old Testament itself, is that Baal was a fertility god. He was a god of the skies who brought rain for their crops.
Thunder, lightning.
Yeah.
In fact, there's an image of him with a warrior's cap on and a sword and a club, and he has a spear which looks like a thunderbolt.
Right. Right. So he brings thunderstorms, he brings rain, which is a good thing for agricultural people.
They depended on it.
They need rain.
So you pray to Baal
right.
to bring the rain,
Right.
yes.
So he's a fertility god. One of the ways, one of the symbols that was commonly used for him was a bull calf.
Yes.
Which was a symbol of virility and
power
and fertility
yes.
as well.
Yes.
So that has some associations. Our viewers will recognize the worship of the golden calf and the bull calf
exactly
as some. And
now,
then
that image is also used for other religions, other gods
right,
as well.
Right. And then, of course, animal sacrifice was a common method of worship.
Yes.
As it was in many religions, including Judaism.
Well, Baal was second in command. The great god of the Canaanites was named El, or El. And Baal was the one who was the executive, you might say, of the gods. And he was always very, very active. Baal presided over everything. I mean, El presided over everything, but Baal was the one who carried out the decisions of the gods.
Now, I believe child sacrifice is thought to have been part of the
especially
worship.
Moloch.
Okay, we'll get to him in a minute, so maybe we'll save child sacrifice for that. What about
but sacred prostitution?
What about sacred prostitution?
Definitely.
That's definitely part of Baal worship.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's sometimes associated with his female counterpart, Asherah.
Yeah, well, Asherah and Ashtaroth.
Ashtaroth.
Yeah,
Who
we know
was
about all
worshipped
these gods and goddesses from these texts.
from that discovery.
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah. So you can see why Israelite people were attracted to Baalism. They too are agricultural people. They want the benefits of this fertility god and goddess. But
Yes.
it drew them into some of these practices which were considered immoral ethically and were polytheistic and idolatrous.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of religion.
And this is what was brought into the southern kingdom by Manasseh.
Okay.
And because it was necessary that they should do that because of policy and political policy, and it was the expedient thing to do.
All right. Now, I mentioned child sacrifice, and you said Moloch, and Moloch's name appears at the end of verse 5 here. So let's talk briefly about the worship of Moloch. That comes from across the Jordan River.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
And it was the religion of those people. And the word actually means king. Like Baal means Lord. Moloch means king. In other words, the head of the pantheon. And but
child
apparently, passing through the fire is the technical word used in the Old Testament, and may imply child sacrifice. Now we left out the gods of the heavens.
Yeah, in the early part of verse 5, this mention of a starry host that the Israelites were bowing down to and worshiping up on their
on
roofs.
the roofs. Yeah.
And so how does this fit into the...
Okay, well, in Canaanite religion, you have the sun god, you have the moon god, and they were associated with planets. And the sun god, obviously, for the sun, but also the moon god cult was extremely popular throughout the Fertile Crescent, Eastern and Western. But then in Jerusalem, not only was the sun worship, but also a god of the netherworld who went by the name of Shulmanu. And that name means sort of a god of the netherworld who is worshipped at the same time. So you have one god of the heavens and one god of the lower regions. And and the planet Saturn was associated with that god. Okay. So you have these, Mars, Jupiter are well known, Venus of course is well known, and even Mercury was known in antiquity and were worshipped as gods.
One of the fascinating things about this polytheistic, pagan, idolatrous worship at the time of Zephaniah is that many of the people of Judah did not abandon the worship of Yahweh.
Well, that's the whole point
here.
That's the whole point here.
Yeah. And we see that in verse 6.
Well, in the intervening verses, there are a couple of things that we were missing, and we don't have time to put them all in, but one of the statements, the accusations the prophet makes is, you say about Yahweh that Yahweh will not do good and Yahweh will not do evil. In other words, there are other gods now that are taking precedence over Yahweh to control what's going on. Yahweh's really way up yonder in the heavens and not involved in what's going on here. And so it is a case of worshiping Yahweh, yes, but also worshiping the gods that are closer to us, nearer to us in terms of weather and prosperity and so forth.
It's the middle of verse 5 that I was searching for a second ago. Those who bow down and swear by the Lord, now there's Yahweh,
yes,
and who also swear by Moloch. So it's very clear that they're continuing the worship of their historic God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they're adding to it the idolatrous worship of all these other gods of the nearby nations.
Well, you're living in the territory where you have the Canaanite religions, and if you're smart, you're not going to make any one of them mad, and so you go along with the.
Now, there are two other
crowd.
important aspects of our printed text. One is what's going to happen because of this idolatrous worship.
That's where the day of the Lord comes in.
And that's where the day of the Lord, the answer is destruction. And the phrase day of the Lord in the Old Testament means the coming of the destructive force of God.
And it's very, very concrete. It's not something way off in the heavens. It's something that's happening down here. It's a day of war. When an enemy army will invade your country and destroy you. That's the day of the Lord.
And just a couple of generations earlier, they saw that happen to the northern kingdom, their cousins in Israel.
Yes.
And as we know, we're just 30, 40 years away from an actual physical military destruction happening to them.
Right. Now they thought, popular theology was the day of the Lord is going to be a day when God enters into our history to destroy our enemies.
Right.
And that would be through pestilence,
famine.
Jeremiah has a litany.
Yeah.
Battle, famine, and pestilence, disease. Right. God is going to enter and destroy our enemies, and we will rule the world.
Now you mentioned Jeremiah, and he was prophesying at the same time as Zephaniah.
Exactly.
And we see even more clearly in Jeremiah how so many of the people of Judah have gotten kind of presumptuous that because they have the temple there in Jerusalem, that God would protect them no matter what, no matter how idolatrous they got or how pagan their worship was.
Well, they're loyal to Yahweh, to their God, traditional God. And we have the temple, and we have the city of Jerusalem, and because of that, God has to save us and protect us.
But Zephaniah kind of turns the tables on them and says the day of the Lord is not going to be the day that God destroys your enemies and lifts you up higher. You are going to suffer that same destruction.
Well, God is going to bring judgment on you. But we're going to see that God's judgment is universal judgment.
Right.
And we'll see that in another lesson.
Yes.
But
this one ends, though, our lesson today ends on somewhat a hopeful note. It's not too late for the people of Judah.
No.
And
repentance is always a major theme.
Repentance is an important option here. And in the third verse of chapter 2, we see this triple. The verb seek comes 3 times.
Yes.
Seek the Lord.
Yes.
Seek righteousness, that is a relationship with the Lord.
Right.
And seek humility.
Right. And now if you will do that, then you have a chance at survival and reversal of this downward trend.
Well, we have 2 more lessons from Zephaniah in the coming weeks. One in which we'll see further reasons for the coming destruction.
Yes.
And then the second one, we'll see more of this theme of hope.
Always, God judges not only Israel but everybody else, but eventually almost every prophetic book ends on a positive note, and Zephaniah will. So, friends, hang on for 2 weeks, and we'll see something positive. But anyway, the point is that God is looking at us and judging what we do and what our nation does. Come back and be with us again, and we'll continue this discussion of Zephaniah next week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.